We're so pleased to have with us today Michael Ignatieff. You know the name, of course. He's written more than 20 books, so you would have come across them. He's an academic, a historian, a journalist, a documentarian. And of course, you might also remember he was the former leader of the Liberal Party in Canada from 2008 to 2011. He has just written a book entitled, very interestingly, On Consolation, Finding Solace in Dark Times. And I guess there couldn't be a more appropriate time to do this. COVID was not it's not what it incited you to do. This was some other very odd, religiously connected event that sparked this book. We'll talk about that. But what do you think of what we're going through now and how we can console each other if we do, or if we're now getting into the angry phase? I mean, we've been through so much in the last 2 years.
Oh, it's nice to talk to you, Pamela. It has been an unprecedented and astonishing event, and we've gone through phases. I think the early phase, first lockdown, I think there was a lot of solidarity. We held on together, and I was astonished, on the internet, the explosion of attempts to comfort and console people. Great artists, great writers, poets, orchestras, got into the business of reaching out when we couldn't have physical contact with each other. And I think that showed how much we needed each other. I think it took COVID to remind us that we can't get through anything alone. And being alone is the worst aspect of COVID for so many people, maybe some people watching this show. The isolation, the loneliness, the sense of your family connections being shredded, all this has been terrible. And the longer it goes on, the tougher it's been. And I think everybody's defining, or at least my defining image of this pandemic has been those excruciating photographs of people going to try and see their relatives in care homes and, kind of putting their fingers up against the glass so that their mother or their dad knew they were there. That's just heartbreaking stuff. And I think we've all been deeply affected by it. And all I can say is I just hope, like everybody else, we're out of this soon. At the moment I'm speaking to you from Vienna, I can't go anywhere without an FPP2 mask. I had a vaccine. I can't go in and lecture in my university unless I've had a PCR test and a triple vaccination certificate. It's really tough, and it's wearing everybody down. But we got to get through it. And I hope this summer we'll be in a very different place.
Yeah, and perhaps change our mindset from pandemic to endemic, and realize that we're going to have to live with these things. It's one of the things about a global world. People get on and off airplanes all the time and bring with them both directions. Now, the other thing, I mean, when you talk about that scene of people's hands up against the glass and noses pressed, I mean, we've seen too much of it. We've also lost, I think, and this isn't new because you document this, Consolation has lost its institutional home. When someone died, we would go to a church, we would go to a funeral, we would mourn. Now we can't even do that.
No, I think that's been a tremendous loss. I know that you're from Saskatchewan, and whenever I have very happy memories of driving around rural Saskatchewan, and one of the glories of rural Saskatchewan have been the churches.
Yeah.
The Orthodox ones, particularly because I have some Russian parentage, and the sense that institutional setting is waning away means that when we have to console ourselves, we console ourselves on our own, and we don't have the comfort and solace that comes from a religion. And part of the point, I think, of writing this book was just to remind people who, like me, have a bit of a problem with belief, just how rich and deep and profound the biblical traditions of consolation are, especially the Psalms. I wanted to go back to that because I think, we can't afford to let anything go. We need all the help we can. And the Psalms have consoled people for thousands of years. So I wanted to understand how that happens. And,
This was you and Susanna going to an event. You were going to lecture on justice in religion. I'm probably not capturing that totally. Just tell the story.
well, yeah, the book began by accident. I was asked to give a lecture, and I went off to Utrecht, which is in the Netherlands, and I walked into this huge hall with like 2,000 people. And it was part of a choral concert in which 4 choirs from around the world were going to sing all the settings of the Psalms, all 150 Psalms. So I gave a lecture. I can't even remember what it was about, really, but I spent the rest of the weekend with my wife just listening to these choirs sing these beautiful settings of the Psalms. And it had a huge effect on everybody in the hall. There were a lot of tears. There were a lot of sort of sense of stunned recognition at the power of this combination of music and words, and it seemed deeply comforting to everybody. And that's what started me on the process of trying to understand why certain kinds of language, certain kinds of music, certain great verses like the Psalms have this power to console us in dark and difficult times.
You then tell the story through a series of historical figures, because that is your life work, being a historian. Your embrace of history and its lessons, and you, I know I've heard you say that you were glad to spend time with these people and understand that people have gone through this from time immemorial. But embracing history at a time when history is being denied or rewritten to reflect today's. Could you just talk to us about that? Because it's a very frustrating situation for many of us.
Yeah, I think the bad news is that we've been rewriting history from the beginning. Human beings are constantly retelling the narrative of how we got here. At the moment, I think there's no doubt, Pamela, that the worry we've all got is not so much about the past, but about the future. You can tell a kind of confident, happy story about the past if you have a kind of hopeful vision of the future. And at the moment, the ceiling is very low. The future seems very dark for all of us. Some of it's, I think, this pandemic that never seems to end, plus the prospect that there will be other pandemics, because as you said a minute ago, we live in a global world. We all travel, and stuff crosses the species barrier from animals to humans, and boom, suddenly you're into global risks. So that is affecting not just our sense of our health, but it's affecting our sense of time. It's affecting our sense of, do we have a future here? And I think, everybody who's got kids knows that the kids are extremely worried about the environment and the ecological future, and whatever position you take on these issues. I know it's a controversial issue in Saskatchewan and Alberta. The reality is that we really aren't sure how we're going to get through the 21st century. We're not sure how we're going to make a transition from a carbon-intensive economy to a carbon-free economy, and how we do that without destroying a lot of lives and traditions and livelihoods in the process. So you put those two things together, and then let's add a third just for fun, rocketing inequality. I grew up in a Canada that was much more equal in terms of income in the 50s and 60s, and the statistics prove it. It's not nostalgia. We're now in a much more unequal society where a few people get a hell of a lot of what's great about being in Canada, and a lot of people don't get enough. And you put these three things together, and we have a lot of uncertainty about what kind of future we've got. And so we're then rewriting our histories to figure out how we got to this place. When we look at the issue of inequality, one of the things we're doing is rewriting our entire history of nation building. We're rewriting the entire history of the relationship between with our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. And this is in Saskatchewan especially, is an absolutely electric issue, and will be for generations. So we don't know how this conversation is going to play out. All we know is we're stuck with each other. Nobody's going anywhere. So we've got to figure out some story about how we got here that we can live with together and share. But all that's terribly difficult, and it's unfamiliar to Canadians. I think we went through a period when I was a young person where we had a kind of Canadian national story. Well, that was from more equal, more pleasant, easier times. We're now in a world where we've got lots of Canadians contesting the national narrative. We've got a lot of statues being toppled,
Right.
a lot of heroes being knocked off their plinths, and it's very destabilizing. It's very uncertain. I just think that we've got to go through this process. There's no alternative. We can't turn back and say, I'm sorry, the national narrative is the national narrative, and you got to shut up and put up and live with it. It's just not going to happen. We've done this before. Let's remember when Quebec surged into national politics in the 50s and 60s, we had to change our whole narrative of the relationship between French and English Canada. And so we have a different story now than we did when I was, 18 or 19. So the politics of the present, I'm getting to my conclusion here, the politics of the present constantly causes us to rewrite the story of how we got here. And that's just the nature of dynamic, innovative, changing societies like our own.
But people who were key players, many of whom you talk about and write in this book, and we'll talk about that in a moment, have now they are dismissed. Now they are rejected. We don't like what those people did. We don't like what they said, and therefore we're going to erase them from the pages of history. That must be the antithesis of what you are as a historian.
Well, I mean, let's take one particular example. I spend a lot of time talking about David Hume, the philosopher, 18th century philosopher David Hume, probably the greatest single philosophical mind in the English tradition. Brilliant guy. He, for years, he lived in Edinburgh, Scotland, and the University of Edinburgh named one of its big towers Hume Tower. Well, recently they've taken Hume off the tower because he said some things about Black people, about slavery, that modern eyes find, jarring and offensive. And I don't think there's any doubt that they are offensive remarks. The problem is that David Hume is a lot more than those remarks. He's the greatest philosopher England ever produced. He's one of the wisest historians who ever lived. And he's one of the most humane and compassionate human beings who ever did anything. So, the challenge we've got, and then the same, flip forward to the Canadian example, we're dealing with John A. Macdonald. I grew up living with John A. Macdonald as one of my heroes, this kind of drunken guy who kind of, lying catatonic and drunk for days and then rallying himself to basically, steer the country through the first 40 years of his life. I mean, a political genius. And yet it's obvious that he was responsible for the residential school system. He was responsible for the crushing of the Northwest Rebellion in 1885. These are part of our national narrative, and we have to take it all in. And so the punchline here is, why can't we hold two thoughts in our minds at the same time?
That's my question.
It's a great builder of the Canada we know today. He is also responsible for some of the problems that Canada faces today. Two thoughts are possible, but expunging him, driving him out, renaming buildings at Queen's University, Canada, because it's associated with Macdonald, toppling statues seems to me the wrong way to go. We need to own Macdonald. We need to own all of it. And this connects to my book in the sense that you can't be consoled for difficult things about your own past, consoled for difficult things that you've done, unless you own all of it. I mean, there's a chapter in this book about Václav Havel, the great Czech dissident who became president of his country. Well, he sits in prison facing up to the fact that he betrayed some of his principles. And he does so with incredible courage and honesty. And I think his honesty allowed him to live in truth about that and become the great leader he was. But you You have to shoulder the burden of truth here, and our country has to shoulder the burden of truth.
Exactly.
And the point is, my truth will not be an Aboriginal leader's truth. We have to sit down and talk it through. And it's going to take a long time. It's going to take generations, and it'll keep going. There's no end to this story.
No, there is no end. And I want to come to that. But when you said Václav Havel, and when I was reading the references to him, it's almost emblazoned in my brain, because it's a quote of his that I love so much. But I'm going to read it just so that we get it accurate. Regardless of where I begin my thinking about the problems facing our civilization, he said, I always return to the theme of human responsibility. And the main task for the coming era is a radical renewal of our sense of responsibility. Our conscience must catch up to our reason, otherwise we are lost. It couldn't be more true today, that we do, as you say, have to take responsibility for some of the things that we have done or things that have occurred in the past, but it's facing up to that reality that everybody needs to go through that process and take responsibility.
Oh yeah, there are no exemptions here.
Yeah,
Aboriginal Canadians have to take responsibility for stuff. Aboriginal leaders have to. We all just have. It's the same business for everybody. Nobody gets a free ride through this midway. I mean, we've all got to step up.
When you talk about as we talk about the Indigenous issues, and it's the words, it's like consolation in the title of your book. The first thing that comes to mind in our modern usage is consolation prize, like kind of coming in second, as opposed to the original meaning of the word, which is to console, and to be together, to offer someone solace. It's funny how that changes.
Yeah, I think part of the reason for writing the book was to kind of rescue the word consolation from its association, in fact, with Consolation Prize. The Consolation Prize is the prize you don't want to win, and one of the great images of that reluctance to be consoled by second prize was the Canadian women's hockey team. Just this famous scene where this woman, is given a silver medal, and they are so expecting a gold medal that they just cannot. It feels like shame to put the silver medal. And it's very human. I mean, they were then required by the Olympics to wear the darn things and be photographed. They look miserable doing it. But there are some times when the best you can do is a consolation prize, and I want to rescue consolation from this area and say that say something very simple, which is that grief and loss and failure just go with the territory of being a human being. There isn't a human being who can get through life without some of those experiences. Right. And the point about consolation is to find some meaning for them so that you can live in hope, so you can get back on the horse and ride. And so I've done a lot of showed a lot of great stories from the past of people who did just that, and I hope people find that useful in their own journeys. But I don't think I've defined all the places you can get consolation from. Heaven forbid. The sources of consolation are essentially infinite. If you just think of I've chosen some music, which means a lot to me, but boy, you think about the music in the 20th century. I mean, there's just an infinite source of things you can put on that just make you feel life is worth living, And God bless the musical traditions we've inherited. So I guess I'm telling an optimistic story. There's the sources of consolation are infinite, and I just want to invite everybody to find their own.
The experts say that actually the reason we listen to sad music when we're sad is that it's not depressing. It is actually that consolation, because others must have gone through it, or they wouldn't have written that song.
Absolutely. Yeah. That in a way is the key. I mean, my sense of what it is when you console someone is that you sit with them and say, basically, I know I know. I know what you're going through. And that sense of solidarity, that sense of empathy is crucial to the process of consolation. And when we listen to music, we have a feeling sometimes that people know what we've been through.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes it very consoling. And this is a tremendously important part of the human experience.
You can think about being a 16-year-old with a broken heart and listening to that song over and over on buying 45 so that you can really hear it over and over again. The other word, and I just want to touch on it before we move on, but reconciliation and reconciling yourself. It's the same dilemma with consolation, prize and consoling, because it's the same thing. We're talking now about reconciliation with the Indigenous people. But reconciling also just means, okay, well, you just got to deal with the cards you dealt, kind of thing. And that's our more common usage of it.
Yes. I think in our reconciliation with Aboriginal peoples, what we're looking for is both accepting and being resigned to the fact that we have a bad history, which we have to share and own up to. But the second part is much more positive. We're looking for how we create a common future together. Where do we go from here? And so we're struggling towards creating a future that we can believe in together. And I think the process of reconciliation is close to consolation in the sense that both are essentially seeking for hope. And we're looking for hope.
I
Aboriginal people.
Love the writing about Lincoln, of whom I am a huge fan, but your description of his ideological dilemmas, his human dilemmas, sending kids off to die, ordering the execution of traitors, and not necessarily coming to an answer on the big question of whether or not slavery could be ended. His own dilemma, seeking consolation and that sense of hope from his religious beliefs, that still remains the kind of quintessential power struggle for politicians. Do you do the right thing for many and hurt the few, vice versa? What have you thought about that in your post-political life or your return to your original life?
Right. Well, I wrote about Lincoln because I one of the things I take from Lincoln's second inaugural is that this is probably the greatest speech in the English language about how you get two people who've been at each other's throats for 5 years to reconcile, to accept certain facts, and to build a future together. And it's a sublime performance. But one of the things that he says, which I think is fantastic lesson for politics, he says basically, both of you guys, North and South, believe that God was on your side.
Yeah.
I'm here to tell you, nobody knows what side God was on. It's not for human beings to know. There is no such certainty in politics. That's where this is the message I take. We can only deal with each other in the here and now, down below, a long way away from God's wisdom. We can seek God's wisdom, we can pray to him, but when we do politics, we have to accept with humility that there's just a lot we don't know. And so nobody should come to the table in politics saying, I've got all the answers, I've got a direct line to God, I've got the right answer, and you have to deal with me. The point about any democratic politics is that there aren't many table clearing claims. We sit around a table and figure out how to slice it up, and everybody gets much less than they all want. But the overwhelming objective is to keep the show on the road and keep the cart from tipping over. But Lincoln is a sublime example of teaching that there's a certain kind of modesty that's at the core of good politics. And that's why, I find him so so inspiring. And clearly in my own political life, I learned all these lessons too late, but this is not about me.
No, but it is connected in the sense to the book. We have both, look, been bruised and battered by our relationship to political parties. I wish I'd kept my distance. If I knew then what I knew now, of course I would not do that. Is there a sense of that? I mean, you came in fairness, you came into the political arena at a time when the party that you were going to represent was on a downward slide. I'm not sure anybody would have really, changed that. We go through cycles here. Did it make you bitter or angry, or like, how have you wrestled with that issue to make it something you've learned from?
I think it was tough. The difficulty about politics is that you lose in public. And,
yes.
and people don't vote for you. They basically say, I like the other guy. And if you're a competitive person like me, it hurts to think, God, I got something here. Why doesn't anybody see it? So losing, and I lost very, very decisively, was a little hard at the start. In my case, it wasn't the end of anything, because I just went back to doing what I did before. Mm-hmm. I think that's important. Many politicians go through a terrible time after defeat because politics is all they've ever done. I was a special case. The next morning basically went back to work at the university, and I've been there ever since, and I'm fine. I think the more difficult reckoning, Pamela, is just what we were talking about earlier, being truthful. I could say, I did my best. Well, the reality was my best wasn't nearly good enough. Being truthful about this is difficult. I eventually concluded that there were simply some mistakes I made because I was inexperienced. I didn't know the ground. There were things that I just should have known but didn't know, because I spent 5.5 years in the game, learned as fast as I could, but didn't learn enough and didn't learn it in time. So you have to take responsibility for that. But you don't have to take responsibility for everything. You don't have to spend your life walking around with sackcloth and ashes with a bag over your head saying, how pathetic I am. You take responsibility for what is properly your responsibility, but you don't take responsibility for the entire Liberal Party of Canada. You don't take responsibility for the history you inherited. You don't take you have to figure out what is the piece of this that you have to own, and you own it for the rest of your life. And that's, that's how it goes. I learned a lot writing the book about that. I feel, I feel fine. I also feel finally very glad to have done it. I wouldn't have missed it in a crazy way. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. Susanna and I did it together. I don't want to get all sentimental, but you really learn the country. Boy, you just stick it into your soul, and that is something that's unforgettable. And anybody listening to this who, hears me say, don't touch politics, it's terrible. Then no, put your name on a ballot. You'll see what it's like. It's an unforgettable experience. And it deepens your feelings about, your country and everything. And so I don't regret any of that. I just wish I'd been better at it. But that's true. That's true of a lot of things in my life. I wish I was better at a whole lot of stuff.
But there is always this with the, you talk about making peace and being truthful about, and that's all right. But loss or defeat or failure is still, it still comes with that dose of humiliation. Like, you feel humiliated, even though you might not have had responsibility. And I just think there maybe are some things that you can't console other people for. You just need to work through it, whatever that means.
Yeah, I think that's right. It is humiliating to lose and lose publicly, and takes a while to get over. And some of this is unconscious. If that's what you're saying, you're absolutely right. Yeah. It takes time. And then you wake up one morning, you feel a lot better. You don't quite know why, but it's true.
You went off to do, as you say, you went back into the university, the world of academia, your comfort zone for sure, and your expertise. You took on another project several years ago, which was to go to run a university funded by George Soros in Budapest in Hungary. Your wife, of course, has roots there, so there'd be some intrigue. But when you look, at the world and the discussions, Soros is either revered or reviled, depending on what point of view you come from. And you were, I think, optimistic at the beginning that Orban might, despite sort of dictatorship rules and regulations, might allow academic freedom. Is it not possible?
Well, it was an extraordinary experience. I mean, Central European University is a pretty good university, and I was willing to leave Harvard to do it, and I was kind of excited with the prospect. And I no sooner had I arrived than I was in the fight of my life to kind of keep it in Budapest, where it had been founded in 1991 to assist the transition from communism to, democracy, and we trained, 18,000 students to be free. That's what we were doing. And I started. It's a wonderful, wonderful institution. And we just got full force attack from a authoritarian state determined to drive us out. And we fought as best we could. We got huge amounts of domestic support in Budapest. One of the most moving experiences of my life was to see 80,000 people marching past our doors, chanting free universities and a free society. 80,000 people. It was just overwhelming experience. So one conclusion is don't write off the Hungarians. Some of them at least know what freedom is, but you can't in the long term oppose a government determined to throw you out of their country. You just can't win that battle. So in 2019, I moved the university to Vienna, which is why I'm talking to you from Vienna. But it was a bitter experience because it taught me, first of all, that the European Union, which is supposed to restrain its own members and prevent them from going off the democratic path, was incredibly weak and ineffective in stopping this. And it also proved to me that all across the world, we're faced with people like Orban who are elected by democratic means and then use democracy to abolish democracy. And that is what's underway in Hungary. I mean, it is still nominally a democracy, but the control that Orban has over the electoral system, the media, the courts, the economy is such that he's got an election next April, and it's going to be crucial because he's seeking an unprecedented, fourth term. And I think if he wins, democracy in Hungary will essentially be crushed. And that's astonishing result if you think of the European Union being a union of 27 democracies. One of them has just been asphyxiated. And so that's a serious matter.
When you look at it, though, the fight was, I don't know, you tell me, less about academic freedom and more about the political fight between the two major players. I mean, Soros, that's also his roots. And those two, Orban and Soros, will be enemies to the death, right? Did you just get caught in the middle?
Well, I'm rather proud of the ways in which we framed the issue as an issue of academic freedom, which is what it was. I just don't think countries have the right to throw universities out of their real estate just because they don't like their political complexion. So we framed it as an academic freedom issue, and we're enormously successful doing so. And I think this really did hurt Orban. But yes, the main event was a battle between Viktor Orban on the one hand and George Soros, a Hungarian Holocaust survivor, multi-billionaire on the other in New York.
So you did learn something about politics in your experience.
Oh yeah, sure, sure. And the aspect of the campaign against Soros, which was shocking to me, was the anti-Semitic tone.
Mhm.
It just, you know, there was a period in 2018 when simply every single poster in the city, and I mean every single one, every tram, every subway, every billboard was "Don't let George Soros have the last laugh." The picture of the founder of my university laughing. Well, if you go back to the 1930s, one of the most standard anti Semitic tropes employed by the Nazis was, "Why are the Jews laughing at us? Stop the Jews laughing at us." I mean, now, this is interesting because if you went to Mr. Orban would deny on a Bible that he was anti Semitic. And I don't actually think he is anti Semitic personally. He will tell you, oh, the synagogues in Hungary are safe and blah, blah, blah. And, some of my best friends are Jewish, blah, blah, blah. But he will not hesitate to use discredited, disgraceful anti Semitic tropes that he knows full well are kind of dog whistle to the anti Semitism in Hungarian culture. And I don't accuse Hungarians of being anti Semitic. That's not where I'm going. But the fact is that 600,000 Hungarian Jews were exterminated in 1944 with the active collaboration of thousands of Hungarian people. And that's just the nightmare from which Hungarian society is trying to awake. And he is absolutely shameless and irresponsible in going back there and using these tropes, because I think it stirs up some very dark water and encourages some very bad tendencies in Europe. And there's quite a lot of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. And you really do not want to play with that fire because it'll blow the house up.
Yeah. You touched on this in your book too, because you write about Karl Marx and Engels and Marx's very intrinsic sort of this picture he paints of they're the money grubbers and the stealers in his conversations about how he was going to make heaven on earth here, but again, so questions about how he's remembered in history. But the story of Primo Levi, a Holocaust survivor, whose life came to an end prematurely. Tell us about that, and why you chose that story.
Well, one of the things for which we all need consolation is what happened in the 20th century. Stalin's extermination of millions of people, including millions of Ukrainians, and the extermination of the Jews. And I have a chapter about Anna Akhmatova, the great Russian poet who memorialized what Stalin's crimes. And then I have a section on Primo Levi. Primo Levi is a young Italian chemist who went to Auschwitz in 1944 and barely survived it and came alive in 1945, and then dedicated the rest of his life to writing about the Holocaust experience in Auschwitz. And I think more than any other single figure, determined to serve as the witness to say, yes, this happened. This is exactly what happened, and we must never forget. And he was also a superb stylist. He's a genius as a writer. But at the end of his life, I think he began to worry that the lessons of the Holocaust had not been learned. There was a lot of Holocaust denial around.
Yeah.
He was worn out from the struggle to bear witness, and appears to have taken his life at the end of his life. And he's a shining light to me because he's so courageous and so lucid. But one of the things about him that's troubling is that I think one of the things that kept him going in Auschwitz and kept him going as a writer was the belief in us, the people who came after, that we would be his consolation, in the sense that if he bore witness
Yeah.
we would listen and we would hear it. And so his work is very challenging to us. Have we learned the lessons? Have we, can he claim to be consoled by the fact that his message has been passed on? And it's not clear anymore. It's not clear. The Holocaust has passed from history into kind of myth and now into kind of a matter of opinion,
and public and a political football, the parties change their positions. Yeah.
Yeah. And that I think would surely disappoint him. So
the one of the issues that I'm working on very actively, and it comes from my own personal experience, my mother with Alzheimer's, and I'm working on medical assistance in dying and allowing people the right to make an advanced request. So when they know they're going inevitably down that road, they can find some peace in advance, knowing that they can die with some dignity. And you talk about, I'd like your views on that, but I'm also interested because you talked about Cicely Saunders and her role, a British nurse who kind of invented palliative care. That is the ultimate in consolation in many ways.
Yeah. Well, it's a book that's mostly about writers and painters and artists who seek to console themselves and then console others. Cicely Saunders is unique in the sense that she tried to create a place, an institution, for those approaching the end of their lives in which they could have the peace and quiet and the relief from pain through good palliative care that would allow them to make peace with their life and make peace with their relatives. And I think one of the she's an inspiring figure because she understood how deeply at the end of life people need to be consoled, and comforted, not just for the pain, not just for the fear of dying, but for making peace with their relations, their family. There's a very touching story that Cicely Saunders tells about asking a woman dying of cancer, where it hurts, and the woman saying, "All of me is wrong." It's a haunting phrase. I mean, when you're dying, all of you is wrong, not just it's not just the pain. It's the whole family thing. So she tried to create a place in which, if all of you was wrong, you could spend time to heal what could be healed. And I think this is one of the most moving and important practices of consolation, and it's had a huge global effect. There's palliative care regimes in most hospitals now, and there weren't in 50, 60, 70 years ago. So she's a heroine of mine, a wonderful woman who I had the great good fortune to meet. And so that's why she's in the book. There's one other astonishing thing that I think may be the most important thing I learned doing in the whole book, which is she got me to, she had the effect on me of making me rethink dying itself. She said, when you die, it's not the end. There's still something extremely important that you can do in the way you die. Never thought of that, which is that you can do something by the way you die that takes the fear of it away from those you love. Well, that's a fantastic thing. I mean, I just don't know whether I'll ever be capable of it, Pamela, but I certainly know what my dying is for now. I want to, if my kids are there, I want to say, look, it ain't so bad. I'm going, but here's what it's like. And let's not be afraid of it. Well, if you could do that, you go to the end of your life being very consoled, because that would be the final thing you could do on behalf of those you love. So
I do think that's so important. I just went through this with a friend who chose to leave with the assistance of MAID, and was absolutely had all of her faculties until the very end, and gathered 10 of us in a room and literally said goodbye. She got to say goodbye. We'd all been doing it over the weeks in advance. But I think what she gave us, the gift to us, was she was at peace, so therefore we could be at peace. We didn't need to mourn this loss. We needed to celebrate her ability to choose it.
No, no. Well, these are very important developments, and I think they can be very consoling. I don't want to be sentimental about this. I mean,
Yeah,
dying
no,
can be
exactly.
absolutely awful for people.
Yep.
My own parents' death wasn't great, but Cicely Saunders points to a much better way, the possibility of a good death, and I think it's something we should fight for those we love, and hopefully for ourselves as well.
I would be remiss if I let you go and ended this conversation before I got your thoughts on what is going on in Ukraine. You do have Russian roots, but I know you've written about this extensively and done documentaries on it as well. Well, what do you think? Is this just another game of politics? Is Mr. Putin just taking advantage of a weak US president? Is it a time to form an alliance between he and like, how do you read it?
Well, I think he's testing American leadership in Europe, and I think his objective is basically to drive the Americans out of Europe and splinter NATO, and then establish his own sphere of influence in which all of the nations that border Russia would then suddenly have their security dependent on Vladimir Putin. And I think this is just intolerable, not just for the Ukrainians, but for the Poles and for the Czechs and for the Hungarians and for anybody, and especially for the Baltics. And this is a big issue for Canada because we just have so many Ukrainians, so many people from the Baltic states, so many people from these countries. It's a live and pressing issue for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Canadians, especially out on the prairies.
Yeah, but right in my neighborhood.
Where do I think it's going to go? I think it's already begun.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
It's already, there's appeared to be a cyber attack on the Canadian Foreign Service. So cyber attacks inside the institutions of the Ukrainian state. There are various possibilities. He may send troops in to create a land bridge between the Donetsk possessions and Crimea. He may go actually for Kiev itself. All I know is that I think Ukrainians will fight and resist. There's a long tradition of guerrilla warfare in Ukraine, which goes back a very long way. So they will not submit to Russian military occupation ever. I think it's also clear that NATO does not pose a threat to Russia. What poses a threat to Russia is liberal democratic states on its border. And if Ukraine was to slip out of the orbit of Russia and become a kind of successful democratic state, that does threaten Putin, because it sets up an alternative model to the increasingly authoritarian rule that he has established in. Now, all of this is, relatively obvious. I think the difficulty that I have is understanding what we can do about it. Clearly, there's a lot of, bellicose talk, but it's not. And there have been a deployment of 8,500 troops, or they're on alert. Yeah. Military supplies have been sent to the Ukrainians, and probably some covert stuff that we don't know about to stiffen their capacity. There's some ships off in the Black Sea, but in a shooting war, I'm finding it hard to see exactly how we hold the Russians back. Unfortunately, if it doesn't come to a shooting war, I'm not sure how the financial sanctions package is going to defer him. I think he's discounted it quite a lot. I think another thing that he knows, and if you're in Vienna, you feel this very close, that anything he does will involve turning off the gas tap to Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And suddenly, this can have a devastating effect on the European economy. So he's playing with fire in every kind of way. I think it's insane, literally insane, to invade Ukraine, because I think it's not he can't win. Taking part of it doesn't solve his problem either, because you're still left with this democratic Ukraine, which is the real problem. So I just don't know how it's going to go. And the final thought, and then I'll shut up, is he is calculating that Biden is weak and is distracted. The Americans are just completely focused on their own partisan difficulties and on Omicron. The British, who are the other major ally, are, the government's hanging by a thread.
Yep, for sure.
Macron in France has got an election in April. So Putin is calculating this is the moment of maximum vulnerability. I think the allies are doing their best here, but the hard question is, how do we have anything that we can say and do that will actually stop troops moving across an international frontier? And I don't have an answer to that question.
There was lots of activity in the last 24 hours because we've seen politicians, Canadian politicians, those who serve in cabinet, holding up signs on Twitter saying, "We stand with Ukraine." And the other side of that being is, you're the guys in charge. Do something. Don't go on Twitter and hold up a hashtag. Is there something we should do?
Well, this then involves the deployment of Canadian forces, essentially. And I've made enough mistakes as an armchair general. I really don't want to go there, because you make a fool of yourself. But I do think these are the questions the Prime Minister will have to ask seriously. If we want a world that is safe from territorial aggression, Canada has answered that question twice, three times in the First World War and the Second World War in Korea. And heaven forbid we commit Canadian soldiers, but let's remember we have, and on precisely this issue. So at some point, and it can only be done in concert with other NATO allies, this is the question we're going to have to answer, and I think sooner rather than later. And it's an extremely difficult one. And I hate empty bellicose talk from, as I say, armchair specialists. Because I don't want to talk us into any stupid action. But I do think this is the issue, not, hashtag expression, verbal support. But do you send Canadian military units to this region to dissuade and deter, and if necessary, to use force? And that's what it comes down to. And I
agree 100%. That is the question. That is where we're at. Michael, I've known you for so long, and you are an extremely resilient person, and to have you now come back with this book at this time, I think we're all very grateful to see you back in this world, but also talking about something that's very real today. All its historical antecedents are important, but we're all looking for consolation. So the book on consolation, Finding Solace in Dark Times, the author, Michael Ignatieff. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah, great to see you.